We're live right now to a unlisted video on YouTube because I was like, I didn't actually promote this at all. I wasn't sure until like right now that we'd even have enough people. The whole sort of chaotic rollout of this was such that like I didn't want to post the video immediately. So the way I'm planning this right now is I'm streaming unlisted to YouTube just so I have a file in YouTube in case something gets lost from OBS. I'm also recording on OBS, and then I'm going to edit later and do a promotional rollout and, like, actually release a proper version of the podcast. Yeah.
Kate is here, so just in time to talk about what Traumaqueer means.
Yes.
Hi, this is Kate at Hypergirls. Nice to see you. Are you guys recording?
Yeah, we are recording. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, Alice was telling me that you essentially, as far as people in empty spaces at least seem to be aware, coined the term Traumaqueer the way people are currently using it. Is that true, or?
Yeah. I actually I started using it originally.
Set of shoes.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Is there any noise or anything?
I'm not getting any, but
okay. So as for the term Traumaqueer, I started originally using this as a joke to just mean queer person with trauma, but as I started getting more into just understanding people's relationships and the worst parts of people's life experiences, I realized that term actually makes a lot of sense. And if you sort of look back at this, it makes sense from like a cycles of abuse kind of angle. Like it's hard to call a person uniquely good or uniquely bad. There's a bunch of these shades to their life experience that form how they interact with others. And often, if a bunch of bad stuff happens to someone, they will propagate this. So this became like a more expansive term in terms of actually meaning like applying like some elements of queer theory to trauma. And it's not very rigorous, to be fair. But a few months after I was using this, I actually made sure, because I was curious about this. I thought I picked up this term from somewhere on Tumblr, to be fair. And so I went out of my way and I searched Google, I searched Tumblr, I searched Google Scholar, and I searched Twitter. And there's no instance that I found where Traumaqueer was actually used in that way.
wow.
So it does, in fact, feel like I was the person that started it. There are some like usernames that had Traumaqueer in them on different platforms. There's one on Twitter. I think there was one on Tumblr, but they didn't use this in this particular sense. They were just, one of them was just some random small follower Twitter account, and another one I think was some sort of Tumblr blog or something. But I don't think they actually were using this meaning of this. So as far as I'm aware, I was actually the person who originally made it.
Cool. I think that is probably a historical moment. Like, I'm essentially going to argue, like, this is, like, when I saw that word, that started clicking for, like, an artistic current I've essentially been kind of following down the rabbit hole since I first started getting really online, basically, and primarily on Tumblr. And
like I said, I think this word is actually kind of largely mutated. Like, a word is only
right.
how people use it. And I've seen more people use it just to mean, a traumatized queer person. But
right.
I do believe that it has its origins in Kate using it as sort of a novel label coined for the idea of queering your own relationship to your trauma.
Okay,
and
can you elaborate a bit on what you think that
for
means?
Dealing with pain and subverting those?
Right. Yeah, can you elaborate a bit on what you think that means? And I am going to argue, essentially condensing a bunch of my contextual argument, that concept of queering your relationship to trauma does actually apply to a lot of the art being made by traumatized queer people right now. and to this particular current that Empty Spaces is part of, but it's by no means coextensive with. And like that's part of what distinguishes it from, say, the mainstream discourse about trauma or use of the trauma plot in everything from like TV to mainstream literary fiction to Marvel video games. We'll get to that in a second. What I found finally was just as a demonstration of the sort of mainstream trauma plot. Remember, like it was like the Guardians of the Galaxy game, and there was this quote from the Marvel Games VP and creative director that um, the entire Marvel family congratulates and thanks the Eidos Montreal narrative team, led by the phenomenally talented Mary DeMarle, for not only delivering the hilarious and charismatic character voices, but also taking players on an emotional journey filled with profound commentary on trauma, grief, loss, and, through the power of found families, redemptive healing, which is something the entire galaxy needs right now.
I think I mentioned this last time, but when I see this kind of stuff, I see less, and it's entirely possible it's there. I see less of like a cynical business move to try and co-opt this language, and more of somebody just kind of accidentally stumbling over the fact that like when people write stories, they put this stuff in it.
Yeah, no, that is probably part of that. That's why I was trying to sort of qualify. Like, I'm not sure. Like, there might be something genuine, like, or there's this kind of like several layers removed genuineness where like people are discovering by citing something that this is part of not just reality but also aesthetics. And yeah, so as I was saying, I've heard the term Traumaqueer from Empty Spaces. I'm not really in Empty Spaces. The fact that I know Empty Spaces even exists is because I'm adjacent to a bunch of circles that aren't necessarily empty spaces that could also self-describe with that term if they wanted. And there's a whole current. It feels like it is a major current of sort of artistic world history right now. And I'm trying to figure out where we see that starting, because there are a bunch of other examples, and I'm curious of things that, specifically in literature, although that won't necessarily be our exclusive focus, like a lot of the sort of contemporary internet avant-garde. Actually, here's an example of this. Do you guys remember the Milady stuff earlier this year? Yeah. So I remember when Mia was getting called out, was just like beefing with people, and this was somebody who was also very much positioning themselves in the internet avant-garde. And when they were just beefing, I think with like Cuteness Unit and with everyone left and right, a thing I recall them saying was like, "Oh, we're not like." I can't remember if they actually used the specific term "traumaqueer," but it's clearly what they meant. Like, it's like they brought the concepts of trauma and queerness into whatever pejorative they were using for what they were defining themselves against as this sort of like positive network spirituality, as opposed to the sort of what they saw as a kind of like self-indulgent, and from there, frankly, kind of right-wing, almost fascist, well, openly fascist, standpoint, they saw as kind of like weak, decadent, like both in dwelling on pain and in being mostly queer and trans and relating it to that.
the way that I was using Angel was actually like trying to subvert other people's use of that term. Because some of the people that I was close with, without naming any names, there's sort of this like online culture of people trying to call themselves like white-hearted cyber angels.
Oh my god, is this literally coming back to fucking... Oh my god.
And so I was so pissed with them trying to use this terminology to like deny the effects of their actions by trying to pretend to be this perfect being. And to be fair, like this stretches really way before them.
When like the Milady stuff was popping off, I literally saw
Milady stuff came after.
I know that came after, and I literally saw people saying that was ripping off Empty Spaces. Was accused. It wasn't actually even Milady specifically that was being accused of ripping off doll Twitter. It was Angelicism.
That's really funny.
Yeah. And in fact, they sort of see those concepts as being related, like, which is interesting. That I think the association happens between trauma and queerness happens both from the inside and from the outside. And in a lot of cases, I think, in some ways, we're more used to now seeing that association from the outside. We're looking at, for instance, this whole moment of, like, groomer panic, where, like, the major allegation being made is that queers are traumatizing children, and queers are using trauma to turn children queer.
But then, like, when I was, like, 11, I was like, I think I'm bisexual. And I tried to tell my parents, I think I might be bisexual. And they were like evangelicals. So they were like, you got molested then. That's why you're bisexual. And I was like very emphatically like against that suggestion. So I was like, no, I'm bisexual and I never had anything happen to me. So I kind of had to like repress. I had to make a choice basically in that position to either like, okay, which one am I going to repress?
Yeah.
Tragic, awful person is a good point. Yeah, I mean, I come from mixed backgrounds. I definitely spent a few years in 4chan and running around anime conventions meeting with CJL people. And then when I came out, they did not take this well. They were fine with me cross-dressing. They did not like me coming out as trans. Yeah, I while I say this, I do come to this from a different perspective. I feel like I don't have like a specific political alignment that I would declare. But after this, I deep dove into like harm reduction stuff for drug users, and like organizing efforts for like mutual aid groups and stuff around me. So I have some amount of exposure to just like local lefty praxis things. And at some point it just became really hard to disjoint all of these things because like leftism and queerness and drug use and trauma and neurodiversity are just like all in this giant connected ball.
Right.
It's like, oh, like, if you're trans, you're more likely to be autistic. If you're autistic, you're way more likely to be traumatized by your parents and your schooling. If you're way more likely to be traumatized, you're way more likely to have some sort of weird, kinky relationship to yourself and things like dissociation, which you're also likely to treat with drug use, and drug use is prohibited. So you will run into issues of like policing and
absolutely.
And so this entire ball just like develops as this like complex system. So that's kind of what I try to get across, at least personally.
And often from those circles, you'll actually see like criticism of like art about queer people dwelling too much on trauma, and like, again, this is often framed, but this is often framed sort of from the outside. Yeah, contemporary trans lit, in particular, like Porpentine Charity Heartstring, or like...
Oh, I love her. She's so good.
Yeah. Like... Or Kate Wirtz, or like...
My girlfriend actually gifted me Psychonym Exile when we first started dating.
Psychonym Exile is one I actually read for this podcast, so yeah, we'll circle around back to that for sure. Like, yeah, insofar as like Andata itself is kind of in this scene that like orbits stuff like surfaces and like a lot of the kind of style of writing I'll see in places like that feels very influenced by her. And like, again, like on the comics front, somebody like Kate Wirtz. On like the music front, people like Devi and Rook and Black Dresses.
Ada Rook, yeah, Void Fantasy.
Yeah.
Void Fantasy is hugely inspirational.
Which is?
Void Fantasy from Ada Rook, the album,
right.
Not the song.
Right, yeah. So this is all stuff you were plugged into when you were developing your artistic vision to some extent. Is that what you're telling me?
It's kind of funny. So if you were to ask me the history of like No More Night stuff, right? Which I think was one of the earlier accounts. I used to say it was the first one. I'm not really sure. I think Alice and Alice both wrote before this. It was just not like combined into some sort of thing like it did with Empty Spaces when the list became a thing and when we all started talking to each other. So, I don't think it's really... I backed off on trying to claim some sort of like, oh, this is what started it. I actually think this was...
I mean, I don't think there is a start. That's kind of what I'm arguing, is that it is this... it's just this historical psychic current that people have been becoming progressively more self-aware of as they end up in conversation.
The interesting thing about Void Fantasy is, like, if you look at the timeline, like, I started writing my alt account with all the horror stuff in, I think, February of last year. And I really heard Void Fantasy first, like, over 5 years ago. So, it's been a while. And I've read Psychonym Exile at the time, too. So it didn't, like, there's, like, this, like, 2 or 3 year gap. And that 2 or 3 year gap, when I first read these things, I was like, wow, this is really cool. Like, I used Void Fantasy as, like, music to, like, do kink and have sex to without really paying attention to what it is. Because I thought, wow, this sounds amazing and it's kind of edgy. In Psychonym Exile, I read and, like, I thought it was very interesting, but I didn't think much more of it. So it took me several years after this. And really, what it really took me, at least personally, is engaging with people who have dealt with a lot of traumatic stuff, who have expressed this in ways which were easier for me to understand. Because while I do have a bunch of traumatic stuff in my own past, it's all a little bit different just because I grew up in different countries. And so for a while I was like, oh, this is really good music to like do kink and have sex to. And then for a while, after this, at some point I was like, holy shit, this is all about trauma. Like, this is also fucked up. Like, the lyrics to this are awful. How did I ever use this music to have, like, fun to? This is awful.
That was the whole thing that happened with Black Dresses, where people were using them on TikTok and, like, Homestuck cosplay TikToks.
But the next stage after this was, like, a year after when I started integrating these things and processing some of my own stuff. I was like, okay, actually, this makes sense, because it's kind of embedded itself in my psyche, and it's the way that all of this works. It's impossible to disjoint this, like, trauma from kink stuff. It's all kind of mushed together. But yeah, the stuff that happened with TikTok, though, is, like, I think it's way more disrespectful in that sense.
And it's interesting. Homestuck is like...
There's a prohibition in the Talmud that whoever sings the Song of Songs as a light ditty is not fit for the world to come. However, at the same time, the Talmud also pretty much openly discusses the Song of Songs as a sexual text.
Yeah, and I think the question there, I guess the question that opens up is, okay, Clearly, if you just take these, if you hold these two like thoughts together, there are ways of talking about sex that are not light in the way that, or sort of trivial in the way that, like, Western art has tended to, like, relegate it to. Refresh us on post-assimilation.
Like, basically what I mean by, like, calling it post-assimilationism, and you're going to hear some noise in the background because my fiance is preparing some vegetables, which is perfect, fantastic, I love him. The thing about post-assimilationism is that I'm using it kind of spontaneously just to refer to, like, okay, the assimilationist moment in, like, you know, queer, LGBT, whatever discourse is kind of over. It died with Modern Family being off the air for, like, the past several years at this point. There isn't, if you look at mainstream queer discourse, if you look at, like, mainstream queer celebrity, it's no longer focused on, like, this very classical model of, oh, we just want, like, you know, single family, like, one husband, or one wife homes. It's not really focused on that anymore. You have, like, people, like, openly bringing, like, kink aesthetics and, like, gender fuck shit into the mainstream. And, like, at the same time, it's divested of, like, an explicitly radical edge and of, like, a large degree of explicitly sexual content.
Thing about that too. When I was making that comparison between, like the really kinky queer person I forgot who's in the Biden administration somewhere that conservatives made a bit of fuss about, like, and like how that person would themselves not be welcome in some parts of the sort of contemporary queer community for those things, because the sort of really the really hardline sort of Puritan or tender queer tendency that's emerged is itself kind of distinct from the mainstream at this point.
Right.
Like, during the whole sort of groomer thing, I just remember thinking about the whole irony of, like, all these conservatives are saying shit that kids on Tumblr have been saying for the last 5 years. So, yeah. What I was saying, like, this side of post-assimilationist culture perceives the association of trauma and queerness largely coming from outside, from, like, the cis gays that sort of just, that's only interested in queer people as a sort of trauma porn, as, like, as a sort of mine for, like, noble suffering within a kind of liberal, like, progress or savior narrative. And then, on the other hand, you have, like, the current that could be described, and there's a couple of different currents, but a lot of the current that I think could be described as Traumaqueer is the people within the queer community saying, well, okay, no, but our relation to trauma is an important part of our queerness, and we can't talk about our queerness without it, and we can't talk about it as if it was, like, completely separate from it, or as if we know how to or want to imagine it completely separate. And we want the right to talk about our own trauma on our own terms. And that's been, I think, part of the broad pushback against the post-assimilationist stuff this year. But essentially what we're looking at with the trauma plot is an entire sort of critical lens. And I think, and this is something I've been sort of trying to articulate in relation to, in fact, it's probably more of a, like, maybe even more of a general critical lens than something like gender, or like the queer reading or all that, but like the um the interesting thing becomes then, like, okay, so on one hand, this critical lens is having its historical moment, and the New Yorker article is kind of like arguing against that in a way that, even though I understand their frustration with this being used in basically a lot of really boring art in like WandaVision and whatever, like basically they're making a reactionary argument that like we need to just ignore this critical lens we've found because we've made it cringe. And in fact, ignore this huge part of our actual lives that we're just starting to talk about. But okay, yeah, this idea of queering your own relation to trauma, I think that is another, yeah, that's another one of the things that I definitely pick up on about this current, because another point of comparison, like I just sort of mapped it in relation to the major currents of like literature and discourse about queerness, but there's also this kind of major current of literature and discourse about trauma right now. And like I remember there being this article that I got kind of mad at, that was in what legacy uh, what legacy publication was it again? New Yorker. Uh, there was this New Yorker article called like "The Case Against the Trauma Plot," and it was talking about how in mainstream fiction and film, like there's been for a while now this sort of trend of structuring characterization around trauma and a particular sort of the idea of, and this is very much framed in terms of, say, conventional linear narrative where trauma is like a backstory, which is again kind of ironic given like I was reading, like, before I started this, I skim read just to put it in this mainstream context and develop the sort of standard relation that we're trying to queer here. Um, I read a bit of that book, The Body Keeps the Score, which prompted my tweets about just how all of mainstream nonfiction is written in the exact same style now. But, like, in that, it's talking about how, like, one of the defining features of trauma is that, like, it's very hard to experience in narrative terms. It's hard to experience as having a sort of beginning, middle, and end. And, like, in the moment, it's hard to experience that way because of the sort of sensory and emotional overload. In your life, it kind of doesn't have that because the way something like flashbacks or any form of sort of repetition compulsion works, like you keep coming back to it, it does not seem to be over in the way other events are over. So the fact that the way the trauma plot and the relation to trauma is used in kind of mainstream fiction right now is as essentially a temporal structuring artifact, as something that creates a before and after, seems deeply ironic. But yeah, that's, I'm trying to think like what are the examples of this it uses. Most of them are things I have not really heard of. Like, I was talking about Virginia Woolf. It's talking about the whole testimony thing, the like traumatic confessional or memoir that dominated kind of the early wave of social justice in the 2010s, as well as like literature. And it talks about Saffron 4 is extremely loud and incredibly close. Talks about Nosgard. Like, okay, this is gonna get to, like, what do people mean by that? Oh, and of course it talks about Hanya Yanagihara, who is another fascinating figure in all of this, because she is basically, as far as I can tell, I haven't actually read A Little Life. I have it. I bought it when it was like, oh, this is the thing in Litfic, but I didn't have much executive function, and I never got around to it. And then there's all this, there's been all this sort of reassessment about it, and the way she, as a cis woman, supposedly fetishizes, like, gay male trauma, and as far as I understand it, she is basically just a fujoshi. Like, she is writing something that would be, like, a cult hit yaoi in the 2000s, but, like, as a, uh, as a doorstopper, like, conventional realist novel.
Like, for a while, I kept away from very traumatized people because I was like, I'm not prepared for this. Which is funny because I also have a lot of trauma. But eventually I reached the point where I was like, okay, I think I actually, like, am stable enough, like, I'm well off enough, I have enough, like, boundaries to start engaging with more traumatized people. And a lot of Number 9 stuff was just, like, talking to people that have, like, gone through way worse shit than I did.
Yeah.
Seeing how they think, seeing, like, what they feel like when they're breaking down, what they think about themselves, how a lot of their stuff, like, what is, like, unsaid in a lot of these dynamics.
Yeah.
And writing about this, like, it didn't start from, like, reading a bunch of books and being like, oh, I want to replicate this. It was very much an outgrowth of explicit, like, conversations with traumatized people.
That's literally how I ended up doing this podcast too. I have the exact same kind of, and I with me it's not so much like deliberately. I mean, it partly had to do with, like, my being around, again, these mainstream cultural currents that I was talking about earlier, and then kind of, like, looking for the contradictions and the real, like, the Zizeki, the Lacanian real in these currents, but also, like, it's just something that seems to happen with me. Like, a lot of, like, a lot of my friends are queer. A lot of my friends are traumatized. This happens whether I'm aware of this when I become friends with them or not. Like, and it has to do with just how I relate to the world for reasons a lot of which I understand and some of which I still don't. Like, when I was reading, I wanted to put, like, a sort of epistemic caveat when I was semi-critiquing Body Keeps the Score there, that, like, on some level, I'm kind of inclined to lean away from, like, physicalist explanations because I have this just inexplicable terror of the body, of thinking about the body, and, like, I had to lie down on the floor while reading that book when it's just describing, like, the vagus nerve. And I have no fucking idea why that is, because if anything in my past is, like, traumatic, it's purely emotional as far as I know, and I'm 27. But, like, there's...
Yeah. As far as I know.
This has been very kind of inside baseball so far. We have been talking about stuff like empty spaces, largely, like, on the assumption of kind of having even a vague idea of what it is, which, as we've established, is very hard unless you lurk more. Like, so we should probably get around to, because, like I was saying, I was pitching this podcast. I've pitched this podcast to, like, several people I know who are not in these internet spaces because I think this intersection of themes is relevant to a lot of people. So we should at least try and introduce things a bit. I guess since we have been approaching this very historically, like, how did that start? Like, what elements came first, and how did they kind of accrete into this thing that exists now as this just like impenetrable bundle of context?
Yeah, so I do want to hear Alice talk because I feel like a lot of people ask me or other people about empty spaces, and Alice is actually like one of the biggest writers.
What I was like, my like means of like introducing that I propose is I'm going to ask exactly how I should be categorized within like the internal lexicon. Like, explain like the lexicon by helping me, someone who is like vaguely interested, attempt to like figure out where I would fit in it if I were to like participate in a fashion. Does that make sense?
It does.
So, like, I gather, like, I'm not sure exactly where I'd fit into this because, like, you know, into this categorization scheme because, like, you know, for instance, like, I've managed to pick up on, like, a doll as, like, basically someone who is, like, sort of victimized, obviously, but, like, responds to this by by identifying very strongly with, like, sort of the fawn response. Sort of just, like, accepting themselves as, okay, I'm empty. I'm, like, kind of a husk for other people to do things with. And I did pick up vaguely on the idea of, like, a combat doll as, like, a subtype of doll who, like, is weaponized. Like, taking someone who is, like, okay, I'm not human, I'm, like, a thing, I'm a husk, and giving them weapons and saying, okay, shoot. And then I did also pick up on, like, the idea of an angel as, like, you know, someone who responds to, like, the, trauma by, like, kind of finding some sort of purpose or mission and just like reorienting their life around that, like the halo as metaphor for like this guiding purpose that like serves as a sort of drive. And like whereas the doll is like someone who like they identify with like the fawn response, like I'm just trying to put this together for myself. So forgive me if I'm like over speaking here. Like, so like what I'm trying to figure out is I'm not sure if I qualify as like a doll because I do like tend to avoid conflict. For instance, I don't like arguing. I don't like exploding or anything along those lines. But I also do feel like very, very strong sense of like purpose and a very strong sense of don't touch me, I'm doing something.
I will just note that while the character quiz kind of frame narrative is fun to engage with, from what I've observed,
one of the main perspectives of empty spaces is that if you ever ask who you are, you don't get it. There's no answer.
Yeah. Well, what I've observed is like whenever someone doesn't really fit one of the categorization things, they just make up their own categorization thing, and that's how it gets
that
so
makes
sprawling
sense.
on that huge.
A lot of people have seen like Elsa's like map of the territory or whatever, and many other attempts to create these like broader classification schemes. When I started doing this, it was way simpler than that. It was just sort of dolls and witches, and it was sort of a very thin metaphor for like victims and abusers. And that has sort of blossomed out as something that has gone way out of my hands. When I write, I just sort of try and like grasp.
So you were one of the first people using this lingo, like, because like
the like doll witch connection for sure.
I think that the doll witch stuff came from Alice, and the angel stuff came from me originally.
Yeah, which makes the historical perspective on this just a little easier, I think.
Yeah.
Starting with like it came from here and then it went to here and such.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a particular person, which I will not name, who I was at some point close with, and I was frustrated with how they were treating other people, and they were using like doll and angel terminology as a sort of like, oh, I'm this like egoless being. I just exist to perpetuate this purpose. Or if I'm not, I'm just this like doll that the other people can command. Or in fact, whether they were being quite a shitty person. So the very original start of a lot of the angel writing wasn't even focused on the angels, but on angel hunters, which was the idea of like there is this being that tries to present itself as pure and godly, and people trying to fight it. And it was actually born out of like venting about the ways that these people have treated others.
Oh yeah,
and
this is very interesting because that characterization of that characterization of angels and like angel hunters, like as godly beings who present themselves as pure in order to like inflict pain, that actually reminds me more than anything else of like the development of early Christianity and like the sense that both Paul and the Gnostics shared of the world as something ruled by hostile angels.
Yep. I've definitely tried to play into that too. I got a lot of people commenting on Angel after I wrote about this stuff. There was a particular person that was like, "Oh, when I was born, my mom was like, you are the perfect angel who will fix my life." It's like, my condolences.
I mean, I literally have an angel name in real life, so...
I think a lot of people treat angels as this, like, perfect divine creature without, so that part, I think, is just embedded in this, like, latent Christian trauma that persists in a lot of people.
Yeah, there's something I want to note is that, like, Gabe and I are both practicing occultists, for one. So, like, I think, like, both of us probably have, like, some experience or, like, knowledge of, like, Enochian magic. And in Enochian magic, like, generally speaking, like, for those who don't know what Enochian magic is out there in the audience, it is, a system of magic based on like a very complex set of like rituals which are to be performed in a very particular sequence involving a language known as Enochian, which is described by Dr. John Dee, who was Queen Elizabeth's court astrologer, as like the language of the angels. And so Enochian largely involves like using the angelic language to invoke and evoke these angels and see the visions that the angels want to give you and hear the messages that the angels want to describe to you. And the very interesting thing that ties into this is that in most Enochian workings, like practitioners of Enochian magic will describe working with Enochian angels as basically like communicating with machines. It's like they're programmed to have one particular course in their existence, and they will not deviate from it no matter what.
But yeah, so in my version, the angel, it started off as a way of writing venting about people inflicting pain on others. But eventually, I saw people start to connect with this, and I realized that there's a very particular push in a lot of traumatized people to be like, if I'm good enough, if I've been remade, I've been reformed, I've been shaped into this particular thing. If I'm simply good enough, if I can do everything that is asked of me perfectly, and I can go through all of the steps, and I can reach the final summit that will finally be worth like divine love or God's love.
You had the question yesterday of what differentiates an angel from a doll.
Oh yeah,
so much about it, and I wanted to come up with a dumb answer to like help you decide how to classify this.
Yes.
This is the best that I have for you after thinking about it for a while. Similar origins to both of them, but it's all about how they respond to the situation that they're in. A doll is somebody who will respond to their pain by getting into age regression. An angel is somebody who will respond to it by acting 10 years older than they actually are.
And, this is obviously a trap. And one of the other inspirations for all this stuff was someone who actually went through, like, trafficking at some point and brought about the idea of false heavens as this kind of, like, there's someone that shows up and and goes, I have all of this stuff. I have the money, I have the places, I have all the connections. You just need to be my perfect angel, kind of thing. And the false heaven in this sense is the it's the groomer. Being honest, it's someone trying to get vulnerable people.
I mean, to connect to like another mainstream trauma narrative, that's what like every single Lana Del Rey thing is about.
And so this started with that started the whole angel thing. A bunch of people started identifying with this. There's this sort of like sub branch, which I actually like being kind of confusing, where there's like angel and angel girl. There's a very specific tweet that references like, if you kill the angel that's been like molded and made into divine purpose, reshaped and reborn, structured for a singular purpose, if you kill that thing, what you get is just a little angel girl who loves you. And this is like harking back to like age regression stuff, where if someone is trying to maintain this perfect persona and this like singular dedication as a way of achieving some sort of like worthiness thereof, if you actually manage to break them out of this, they usually are just like a little collapsed tile that doesn't really know how to survive.
I remember randomly coming across some of your tweets and just finding that like some of the imagery kind of funny. Just like the idea of just like an angel girl as somebody who is kind of just like a rapidly moving object that has the tendency to collide with things.
Oh yeah. What you're thinking about is a particular thing where it's like angels don't really fly as much as they like glide through air. And like phase in and out of existence, and whenever someone's trying to offer them any sort of support, they just kind of like phase into existence around that and then disappear again.
that actually reminds me of something a little, which Gabe mentioned in his document for this, which is like in the seminal trauma web series Alfred's Playhouse. Like in the first part, like there's the part after like Alfred has like a flashback and like a delivery man comes by to like drop off a package, but Alfred is in full flashback mode and just babbling incoherently and opens the door, and you see it from the delivery man's perspective for a second, and Alfred is just babbling nonsense, just grabs him and pulls him in and just keeps blabbering nonsense at nobody in particular, and the delivery man is just confused by this and starts to cry and throw money out of his wallet.
Okay.
But honestly, like, the thing that really connected with angels and why it actually became a thing, aside from doll stuff, because doll stuff has a lot of kink background to it, and I think that a lot of people identify with this. That I don't know, it just has. I feel like it has more like broader appeal to a lot of people.
Okay. But anyway, let's pass the and on that note, let's pass the mic back to Alice, because I think it's very funny that while we're talking about this, we have this dynamic of like whatever the fuck us three are doing our thing, and essentially this doll sitting in the corner.
It's okay, I'm used to it. I'm good at sitting still for a bit.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, sorry.
I'm just gonna say that this is sort of where my awareness of things comes into place, because my wife sort of has her own preoccupation with angels as an imagery symbol piece of metaphor, which is pretty separate from Kate's own perspective, but she still had sort of glommed onto following Kate for her writing, and was sharing a lot of that stuff with me, and at one point people started to use the doll word, and I got kind of excited about this because I had already developed sort of a reservoir of like personal writing using dolls as a symbol, and ended up like sharing a bunch of that work with Kate and getting a really like excited reaction of like, oh shit, this is really, really cool. A lot of these like tropes that you're working with are like things that I can see like people I know being excited about. And then just sort of got to ride the like brief initial high of like, oh shit, this person that I admired is like not only into my work, but is like sharing it with their Discord server, and like they're all going like, oh shit, this is so cool. Anyways, should probably get into like where it all comes from for me personally and why I got so excited about this. So a lot of my own trauma is to do with like specifically like grooming and abandonment, like specifically like unexpected abandonment. I grew up on the internet, like getting I would say sexually groomed in a handful of small ways by like people who just sort of kept me as like a weird pet and like played games with me and shit, and then entered a like longer term relationship with somebody who I would eventually come to describe as a groomer, just because they were like, you don't need to worry about all the details of life, I'll take care of you, yada yada yada. And then sort of tried to raise me to be their like ideal wife pet creature, and then dump me on my ass when that didn't end up working out for them. And the experience of being integrated into their family briefly, only to get sent back home and given a letter, like retroactively stating that they like didn't actually want their relationship with me, like halfway through the time that I had been spending with them in person, just sort of like obliterated my sense of self for a while, and started me down this path of developing this this like broken toy metaphor, I guess. And this is where dolls come from, is this sense of like, even if it wasn't necessarily good for you or a good time at the time, this period of life where you were like picked up and treated as an object of intent and as something that was like useful and being like made into something specific might just be like the best memories you have of like being an object that has like a purpose, and of like
So, like, is there a difference between, because I know purpose is a big, like, is another word used a lot in Empty Spaces, and it's also used a lot in the
that got
angel
kind of
context.
dragged into the angel thing,
Yeah.
right? Of the like perpetual motion and of the like
honestly
wanting to be worthy. And the secret here is that, you know, dolls and angels have like much more overlap than either of them would be willing to admit. You know?
Yeah.
It's kind of like an embarrassing overlap.
I joke that dolls are just angels, where the halo is like a sphere around them, or anything that interacts with the sphere.
Yeah. So, you know, after getting all of the like embarrassing personal sharing out of the way here, this got wrapped up in a couple of other feelings that I had through life, and it's funny that you brought this up earlier, but like you said, doll gets used by a lot of different people for a lot of different reasons. I was not by any means the first person to pick this up as like a personal metaphor or as like an identity term or anything. And one of the ways that people use this is something that I just sort of stumbled upon independently on my own, is this feeling of like artificiality and construction and femininity. I got to a weird sort of choke point, I would almost call it, like a couple years into transition, where everything was sort of going well for me, but I was sort of stuck with this, again, like this feeling of being like constructed like that and not being able to escape that. And it's not even like I was unhappy with it or that I found it fake or artificial. It was just like hard to escape this feeling that I was seen as that, or and this got wrapped up in the doll thing big time. There was sort of like a short game that turned into a novel that turned back into a visual novel again that I was writing all through university that was about this exact thing. And that's when I started picking up doll as a symbol both for, again, being something that somebody made for a specific purpose, and then you were able to fulfill that just as being like an object and not a person for them, and then eventually getting put down and having that be behind you, but also of being constructed and fake, and beyond that, of just sort of being into the fun of the idea of being like a familiar with a modular body, kind of. Like, this was a fun space for me to sound, again, in this like 2 years into transition space of just wanting to make something super, super self-indulgent, but I ended up putting together this whole vast setting of both Magitech is the word that I like to use for it a lot. That just borrows straight from like Final Fantasy or whatever the fuck, but a setting where you have this like Victorian manor aesthetic, but also it's built on top of like almost like high tech being applied to people as they're converted into a digital consciousness and then given like a physical body that is made up of little parts that they can do whatever the heck they want with, and that being kind of like a liberating experience that still also makes you like an object implicitly, and like the fun and weird contradictions of that.
I mean, it's kind of a gothic cyberpunk thing, and again, I was thinking about, I watched Ghost in the Shell Innocence recently, and like that's the aesthetic of that, which
yeah, and There are a lot of influences for me coming out of tons of weeb stuff like that I would have to spend days compiling. But like somebody brought up Resin Maiden earlier, and obviously that's like unescapable.
It's kind of interesting to see the merging of doll, as in like 40s term for woman that refers to like a sort of very constructed femininity, to doll as in very Rosen Maiden influenced, I want to say.
But yeah, then I spent a few years being a little too embarrassed to share it with anybody else, but just being on my own and writing smut about these dolls and their owners, which eventually worked into this concept of witches because I thought it was a cool image, basically, and also because of Toho. Admittedly, I can't get away from that. Alice Margatroyd is the OG. But yeah, writing about like modular bodies and about giving people you're in an unhealthy relationship with like root access to your brain and letting them format that however they want. And eventually, at some point, I realized like, oh fuck, I am also still writing about my trauma when I try and make this like self-indulgent stuff. Like in the process of trying to chase something that was like less pretentious, and in the sense that I was trying to make something good, and more pretentious in the sense that I was trying to make something that was just exactly what I wanted out of anything, I had accidentally started like writing about my own issues. And part of this comes from an author who I think briefly obliterated their presence off the internet, but I have recently caught up with them, who is writing a lot of really good fiction about modular bodies and like trauma and like unhealthy relationships. And specifically, there's a story called Serene that was written over many, many years. That's about like an android girl who is specifically like a conversion from a biological consciousness, and only very recently got out of like a terrible, terrible relationship with a childhood friend where they were giving them like complete control over that like converted brain, and have recently found out that they were having a bunch of their memories written over to like suit this person. And then they accidentally have like a one night stand with their own like tech who's like in charge of doing this stuff with them like officially, like maintaining their brain and body separately. And they realize like, oh fuck, I actually like do kind of want to return to this in like a safe, controlled, weird way. But also I don't know what this is going to do to the relationship that I am now building with this person who is already important to me. But yes, this was a massive, massive inspiration to me. And I ended up just sort of running away with that and this, and creating this unique little doll creature. And getting really excited when I ran into Kate and seeing other people using the doll word in relation to this stuff.
And this idea in this story of it sort of moving to a safe, controlled context sort of maps to how the doll witch terminology seems to have moved from kind of victim abuser to also being like just sub-dom.
Yeah, I took the encouragement I got from sharing this stuff with Kate to get really excited and start putting myself on a path of writing every single day about this, and people started seeing that and cropping up around it. And obviously, a lot of the energy that got tapped into was people who already identified as dolls, as Kate brought up. And that was a really interesting situation because I was approaching this from a very specific bend of like, dolls aren't people in like a denigrating way at first, like almost exclusively. And a lot of people were like, well, this is like my positive way to self-identify, to see myself as like something created that has like intent and purpose and grace and all that stuff, and like I'm owned and that's good, which is its own thing that I have my own feelings about. But like there was a lot of different people in this great big like melting pot of people who were attracted to the word doll suddenly being like a hot term again. And I think I was just kind of in the right place at the right time to take advantage of that. Well, not take advantage of it, but like catch the wave.
You take advantage of those dolls.
I've taken advantage of so many dolls now.
And
yeah, this was a really weird process for me because I sort of put my like trauma metaphor on the internet that's like roughly approximating my own mistreatment and like of my own weird feelings of returning to it, and then that rapidly got grabbed and turned into like not just like a series of like tropes and a personality test and like who are you in this, but like people taking witch and making that meaning like a ton of different things that I didn't even understand. Like, just being from my point of view, these are just the abusers, but I have people who are writing witches as being, like, any kind of person entrusted with power in this situation.
Which is, like, very interesting to me, because I had a perception of witches before the one that you imagined. And, like, even, like, some of my friends who had, like, nothing to do with empty spaces, but were, like, trying to do, like, psychedelic therapy for others, identified with the witch label. And to them, it was this kind of, like, creature on the edge of the forest kind of vibe. Like, you don't have to fully transgress to beat them, but you do have to actually go out of your way. And when you get there, they have a bunch of capabilities you may not know about, and they may transform your life experience and change you. And so I feel like even before the, like, witches abuser metaphor, there was a bunch of stuff regarding witches as, like, changing people that was like an established, even in, like, the very recent years, somewhat established, like, identity or, like, view on this. So it's like it got, like, doubly flipped. Like, it got flipped from, like, a witch is a helpful person who's outside of the confines of, like, normal society, to a witch is an abuser, to, like, this, like, gradual slide back to, like, which is a dom that's kind of shitty, which is the controlling person, which is just a dom, which is mommy or
We've
whatever.
seen these multiple flips with almost every category we've talked about so far, and also this idea seems to be that, like, before empty spaces per se, we can find, like, internet outsider Traumaqueer people using all of these symbols independently, which is interesting because I'm wondering, like, where in the collective unconscious this particular set of, like, symbols is just forming. Like,
Yeah. So from the start, it's already, like, incredibly diverse, like, the reasons that people are here and the ways that people describe them. And then you have this weird situation that we tried to dig into earlier of, like, everybody creates their own mythos when they do this, because it's decentralized and because it's no rules, just right, and because it's all this other stuff. Creating this scenario where everybody is world building in the same room separately. So you just sort of have buzzwords that roughly align, but everybody is using them in completely different ways. I think Angel is really fascinating in this regard, just because if you ask 10 people in empty spaces what Angel means, you would probably get, like, 10 completely different answers.
yeah.
So you're saying that empty spaces is very much like a Jewish endeavor, as a Jewish person myself.
I don't think anyone else here is anyone else here Jewish enough to answer that comfortably.
I actually kind of thought about converting to it because Elsa's Jewish. And in fact, I did think about converting to Judaism after writing Empty Space and stuff. So maybe you're just slightly ahead of me on that.
Yeah. I was
like, there's different parts, and some people that don't like empty spaces keep thinking that they're going to fracture along these lines. But honestly, these parts get along well in my experience.
Yeah, that makes sense.
There's the, like, June and her, like, ball of people that are more like psychosis, mania, magic. There is, like, me and some other people that are more, like, writing about trauma, processing stuff, and recovery stuff. And then there's, like, Belle and Doll, Alice, and some other writers that are just like, oh, I'm just going to write this microfiction, and I'm going to expand my skills as a writer, and make a lot of these scenarios kind of thing. So there's, like, different parts of this now. Like, it's kind of branched out into a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
The other part of Empty Spaces is that as subtle as this is, and I tend to think that this is less subtle than a lot of other people do. Empty Spaces does in fact cloak itself into this, like, stealth language. Like, whenever someone sees this online, like, they don't necessarily see trans issues or race issues. They're like, what is this doll and angel thing? Why is this written in this awful way, kind of thing? And, like, I had the pleasure of listening to someone do a podcast in Empty Spaces. There's this other podcast called Cult or Not. and they barely got any input from any of the writers. I think
shit.
Els wrote them a small thing. And so they had this like hour and a half long podcast about this because they ran across a post made or retweeted by someone into like a greater sphere. And they were just so fucking confused about what this is.
That reminds me of... Keep going. Sorry. I was just going to say it reminds me of like when one of the parapolitics Twitter guys did an episode on SoundCloud rap about like occultism in SoundCloud rap and kept trying to like spin it into some conspiracy narrative when like he very clearly did not seem to be that grounded in like in the scene, but also
these people say these people really liked empty spaces. This entire thing was drawn out by a woman who is like bisexual and clearly traumatized, somewhat connecting with us and dragging her husband into it, who had no fucking clue what the fuck is going on. And so they actually had a very positive review of this. But it took them like she stayed up for like several days trying to figure out what the hell is going on.
I mean, that happens with any internet subculture. That's better than professional researchers on internet subculture. If they did something like empty spaces out in a couple of days, nobody in my university could do that. Like,
it is in fact successful in the way that I think that by the time that you try to you understand enough of this to make any sense of this to launch an attack against it, you're sort of close enough to it. So it ignores there are no right-wingers dunking on this. There's no people quote tweeting this and being like, "Oh, look at what these queer people are doing," because it all reads strange.
Yeah, it reminds me of that one time that Elizabeth Sandifer wrote knee reaction to Basilisk, and then one of the people in the rationalist community. I forget exactly who it was.
Was it Promethea?
It might have been. In any case, I just recall them writing, Elizabeth Sandifer, welcome to the rationalist community. You're writing about rationalist subjects, therefore you are now part of this community, whether you like it or not. There is something that I find very funny about just, seeing people online being like, I'm one of the dolls, and, I'm trying to figure out, are you signaling that you're a part of empty spaces, or are you signaling that you're a part of, a relatively more mainstream trans women scene?
Or are you signaling that you're, in Dolette Red Scare thought culture, depending on the fucking...
I feel kind of bad, because I think that doll, especially in the, people of color part of trans spaces has been this sort of badge of yes, I have artificially constructed my femininity. I have done this extremely well. Witness me, see me as for all the effort that I put into being like this. And it's sort of almost it's a compliment without really any of the intentions of the empty spaces stuff. But I mean, these people are also subject to a lot of the same drama.
Well,
as empty spaces.
And it's the fact that is your metaphor for a successfully constructed femininity does speak to existing in a culture where femininity is partly articulated around that sense of artificiality and that sense of objectification.
It should be noted that I think the non-empty spaces sense of the word doll almost kind of references fucking 40s fucking slang what do you want, doll?
There's a very I think Zoll at some point was part of the interview of someone too, and this is back 50 years ago or something, and I just the evolution of doll into Zoll as a statement of someone in particular and how they were describing their friend group, it implies this entire continuity of evolution.
I've never
of these
heard
words.
Of this.
Sort of.
I mean, I don't think. The way that I see doll isn't so much the 40s femininity kind of thing, but doll became this before and around AIDS epidemic, especially in people of color communities, is the term, which is itself probably a recall to the time where it was used earlier. But I actually like that part of it more so than the older one. But
well, I remember when there was, race in empty spaces discourse a little while ago, and some people were bringing up that, it seems kind of overly white, both in terms of, the demographic makeup, but also the aesthetics, specifically this, again, kind of Rosen Maiden kind of European Gothic kind of imagery.
The Slenderlands, the white porcelain.
Yeah,
fragile,
and I'm wondering
yeah.
on some level, could the way something like doll was used in these non-white contexts be somehow plugged into to make a bridge there.
In line with the occult thing, I've kind of been waiting for a while for somebody to come at me why'd you grab at the term witch that real people use for real practices? And I have been a little bit sheepish about this. But it's happened with surprising infrequency. I feel like I've only seen it once or twice.
I feel like this is very...
I've seen it once, I think.
Yeah. I wait till it moves to TikTok. Then shit's gonna hit the fan. But
and the funny thing is that I think that the one person who I've actually seen do this has I've known people that have met them, and it without saying names or anything in particular, it just doesn't sound like they have a very good grasp of how to treat other people. So
yeah, no, it's a thing. I mean, I'm certainly not the kind of occultist who thinks there's any particular use to boundary policing practices when it's a specific marginalized practice is one thing, but just the sort of authenticity discourse and the fact that I think everyone to some extent is aware fucking the she's the queen of turfs now and everything, but Harry Potter was a major sort of thing for cultural thing for a whole generation. I think anybody doing these practices is aware that there's Dungeons and Dragons now. Anyone doing these practices is aware that there's just a cultural imaginary around them that has nothing to do with and that in fact has been, if you look at say the changes to how magic is presented in Dungeons and Dragons through the Satanic Panic, has been systematically stripped of reference to the real thing, and that's fine. That's a natural sort of fact of working in this space, and of working in a space that that modernity essentially considers fictional, so that there's this then completely again decoupled off fictional fantasy realm of it, where it doesn't have to interface with the real world at all, and then you bring it into a different interface with the real world, and any artist can bring it back into a different interface with the real world, and that is itself part of the beauty of it and part of how it works. I don't even consider my actual practice that ontologically different from how I do art anyway.
And I think, to be fair to the handful of people who have come to me about this, despite the fact that they weren't terribly fair to us, I don't think they were more you don't know what you're invoking. This is some sort of mass self-hypnosis by mistake. You're holding a giant seance on the internet or whatever. They weren't you're taking this away from me.
Right.
I think most people are roughly familiar with the piece of algebra you play when you're nobody's really accusing Evangelion of cultural appropriation.
Yeah.
For taking
well, the
all
thing
the
is sorry, my brain went there because the occult community absolutely does have some of the most insane cultural appropriation discourse left on the internet. But yeah, that is a whole other conversation. The idea of a sort of unwitting mass hypnosis, that's an interesting one, because that is one I can sort of more see, and it just ties into, I guess, the general critique. I mean, it sounds like a more abstracted and chuny way of articulating the broad critique honestly of identifying with your abuse, identifying with your trauma. And it's like, yeah, that is the thing that's like, how do you think about it as how do you think about negotiating that?
I was just gonna say, I think I've talked a fair amount about being, at least from the outset, a little terrified of this idea of people using my writing to perform some kind of self-harm, like accessorizing beyond that. And my view on this has sort of evolved in two ways. And the first is that I simply need to be proud of what I put out. Like in the first place, I need to make things that I feel like represent these dynamics in a way that like both appeals, but also like appropriately repulses or whatever. And as long as I don't feel like I've done that poorly, I don't have too much to worry about in terms of being conscious, at least. But also on the other side of this, as somebody who grew up on the internet, like being raised by image board wolves and looking at the worst shit imaginable, I don't know if there's a solution to getting the kind of person who's in the position to be harmed by this to like not open the box and look at it.
Yeah.
You can only really like do your best to, execute on that well in a way that like minimizes it, I guess. Like Kate's saying.
Yeah.
Burner bother me. That used to be like stuff that felt like they were really buying into the power exchange from the wrong angle of like, how do I be a doll? How do I like give myself over to somebody else completely in a way that's not entirely what I wanted people to get out of this? And, every time I get that now, I just kind of think like, I hope they stick around. Like, I hope they read something that appealed to them in this way, and then they stick around and they keep reading my work, and they keep reading until they like it clicks for them.
Yeah.
I don't know. that like there is like something positive to be taken here in terms of like, if you throw away certain things, then you can feel impervious from that in a way that doesn't require you to debase yourself, but emphasize your own best qualities or whatever. But on top of that, like, just looking a little bit more skeptically, this total power exchange thing.
I think that there's so many other places just out there offering that right now. There's this explosion of cults that are converging on what I call the monocult. There's, like, the whole sort of, like, the various, like, gender poisoning, like, incel, femcel, red scare, all that shit. Like, every one of it essentially, like, a weird, improvised, sadomasochistic game. Like, within a database signifier space. And this is, like, doing art with, like, power flows and database signifier spaces that is still art, and all art is that. Sorry,
Spent pretty much all day hurting angels in different ways.
What does that entail? Go into a bit of, like, again, I guess, like, what the lived experience of these kinds of relationships.
A lot of the stuff that I wrote on my own account often is either my thoughts after talking to people, or in some cases when it's actually like close to what they were describing as their life, I will actually ask them if I can write. I can write stuff either about their situations, or if I can try to empathize with them by writing about what I think it might feel like. Because a lot of my writing is from the perspective of either like abuser or victim. And so for a while, my writing was driven by connecting to people because they emphasized in writing, and then them coming and opening up to me, and then me seeing, like, either learning something from them that I can incorporate and process with writing, or in some cases actually asking them, like, hey, can I try to emphasize you by writing stories? Virtually all of them said yes. And so I eventually just accumulated a group of people that I like. Some of them I've met, some of them I've not. Some of them are online and very different from me. Some of them are like fairly close to me. And so sometimes I refer to this group as darlings too. But angel herding is like a lot of these people have been through a lot. And I don't mean this to minimize my own experiences, but when I say that they've been through a lot, I mean they've been through way more than I was. And so in the process of doing things like setting up like meetings sometimes, or helping them process things, or sometimes talking to even several parties from the same event. Like something Like they live together, they work together, it fell apart. It's been like 2 or 3 years since, and they're both processing it. So I sort of act as this intermediate party to it. And so hurting angels is the general term for engaging with a lot of this, which is like pretty heavily traumatized people and trying to get better or process what happened to them, and me trying to like help them stay on track, or like sometimes mostly supporting them, sometimes helping organize like meetups or even trip setting them in some cases. So angel herding is just like it's like willing emotional labor for people that I actually care about.
I do a ton of that too, and it's like you're probably much better at it than me, like, but it's something that I've always felt called to do.
It's really fun. I mean, I think if I felt compelled to do this, it was never like choice of my own, which I think happens to some people, and I would be more frustrated with it.
That's a fair distinction, because literally a character in one of my back burner projects I need to find time to get back to is a guy who felt, and when I say compelled, I mean compelled in the good way, the way I'm compelled to do my writing or anything, but it's like, the character in the thing I'm writing felt compelled to do that in a bad way, like, as a kid. And, not to go on another huge tangent, but, like, basically his, like, function in the magic system of this setting gets changed to make it so that, like, he's less sort of tempted or obligated to do a ton of this while he's a kid.
Yeah. A lot of people that have tried to do this, I feel like they were trying to sort of just like, for their own trauma, try to like justify having value or meaning by helping others. And this often ended up in them getting burnt out, because if you engage with a lot of people who have been traumatized, they'll often just always have emergencies. And so you're always just jumping from one thing to the other, and eventually you just feel like it's hopeless. I actually never really did that. So I really came into it.
I'm just going to note that this is a whole set of social dynamics that gets, like, so little actual, like, coverage or representation in literature, and I think that's what something like Empty Spaces is breaking ground in, but that's what I'm arguing a broader sort of Traumaqueer aesthetic that, like, I would ground or situate Empty Spaces in is also doing. You've used the term fawning a bunch of times, and it's a term I see used around Empty Spaces to a degree and in a way that I don't really see anywhere else. And
Right.
I'd be curious if you can go more into that, especially since I think one of the places I've seen it is the context of like a fawn or something approach that's sort of like used as a contrast to fight or flight, and I thought that was an interesting kind of, because when I was reading The Body Keeps the Score, so much of how that defines trauma is around the fight or flight response, and that feels like, in some ways, a reductive angle that doesn't account for a lot of, like, emotional trauma kind of stuff.
Who was the first person who, let me see, was this the From Surviving to Thriving thing? There's a particular author that introduced, like, other trauma responses.
Right. Okay, that's
so
curious. I want to know who that is. They seem based.
The traditional approach to trauma is fight or flight, which has usually been observed in like animals.
Yeah.
And so in animals, fight or flight is very direct. Fight is you fight whoever. Flight is you like literally run away from them. I think the person who wrote complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. Who was he? Said that there's like 4 different responses, or maybe 5 in some cases. Even
this sounds like a much better book, low key. I should probably look at it. Maybe, okay. We could go into critiques of it too.
It's its own issues. Pete Walker is the author of this.
Pete Walker, okay.
But the fawning thing, at least, I actually very much appreciate as an addition.
Yeah.
So the idea is, aside from fight or flight, there's also freeze and fawn. So freeze is kind of hard to describe, especially as people got more into this. Flight became less like literally running away and more like running away from the problem into something. So people started saying like flight can be overworking, flight can be like escaping into daydreams, flight can be like sort of like reading too much or engaging with like media and art instead of dealing with your problems in front of you kind of stuff, which is kind of hard to differentiate with freeze at certain points, where freeze is just like, I do not want to exist, I want to minimize the amount of space that I take up. Freeze is like, I want to make myself as small as possible. And these things are kind of hard to tell apart sometimes, but fawn is a very particular one, which I've seen this. I think I've seen this in real life. I've seen how people switch to it. And the idea of fawn is that you are so trapped that you simply try to appease your captor in any way that reduces like harm or damage to you. So you don't fight, you don't flee, you don't freeze. You simply try to become the thing that they want you to be, which can be anything from like trying to become a perfectionist and trying to like succeed at the goals that they intend for you, or in like the very other way of like sexual fawning of like, I want this person to like me. I'm simply going to do anything that they find appealing to present myself as like a likable person.
Yeah.
I will satisfy anything they want from me because I want to win them over.
Yeah,
and fawn has these like, I think that people sometimes confuse acute fawn and like long-term fawn. In a lot of media, especially Pete Walker stuff, it's kind of brushed over. Because acute fawn is like, if a cop yells at you, like drop on your knees, put your hands behind your head, kind of stuff.
Genuflect.
I think a lot of people will drop into acute fawn. You're like extremely like afraid. You have a series of requests being put upon you, and you satisfy them in order to not be harmed. Like acute fawn in a lot of cases is terrifying. Like you're very distressed. You come out of this like with like a heavy trauma reaction, where sometimes like people like throw up after it, or they feel like they have this like drop after that experience. But people also talk about like long-term fawn or this like people-pleasing personality, where it's like it's become like so second nature to you. You think that your value lies in fitting the models of that people want for you. So you become this like people-pleaser. You don't try to stand up for yourself. At some point, you lose track of like what you want to be or what you feel in some cases, instead preferring to simply express what people want you to be. And these two things are like they're connected, but they're not quite the same either. Because I think that like a lot of like acute fawning is like scary and stressful, and your body reacts to it in the same way. But like long-term fawning, I think some people can feel almost satisfied. It's like submission in like a kink context. I think a lot of people that have developed these like fawn identities actually like kink, where they can simply be submissive and they can just be told what to do.
Yeah.
So angel and doll stuff aside, there's a particular bit that actually has a lot of like a lot of valence in my mind, which I don't think a lot of other people picked up on, but is like specific to the way that I've seen the world at different times, which is the whole like angel versus demon versus fate thing. Which actually like I think Angie talked about like systems thinking, how it can be detrimental sometimes. And I like when I grew up, at least like, I traveled a lot as a kid, and I came to the States. I went through school, and then my parents left, and then I had to deal with everything on my own. So I had this perception of like, there is me, and that's what matters. Like, there's a sort of circle around me about stuff that I care about, and I can expand this circle. I can include places. I can include people. I can include something like outside of this, and eventually this became this like demon terminology. And with the use of psychedelics, I started thinking more about like less like people specific thinking and more about like pattern specific thinking. And then eventually I got introduced to systems thinking. And they actually map pretty cleanly in my mind to like demon, fae, and angel respectively. It's like the demon has no particular values or bounds. They don't believe in pattern influence. They simply believe that they are a single entity and they get to decide what is like outside and inside of their bounds of care. And then the Fae think more about on the level of like pattern propagation, like ideas, thoughts, memories, like personality patterns kind of thing. And if you actually like construct this view of people as nodes in a graph where certain ideas propagate, you can sort of draw this like expansive patterns. And it feels like patterns themselves have a certain amount of like will to live. Like certain like political is a very good example. Like if you have a certain political idea, rejecting this in favor of something else causes a certain amount of pain to the person who's carrying that idea. So you have this momentum of like not only maintaining it but expanding this to people around you, so there's less friction between you and others. So patterns have this like entire like weird like lifestyle of their own. And angels in this view end up as systems thinking, where systems thinking does not personify any particular part. Like there's no actors, there's no patterns. There's just like specific combinations of elements and the ways that they move between them. And I think that systems, at least in my view, do not have any sort of like survival instinct or ego or anything like that. They just exist.
It's Crowley's sand roses.
They can affect things and they can like include actors and patterns into them at some point, but they don't have any sort of like personal statement. They just exist.
Yeah, that makes sense. I would like to hear you expand a bit more on like the demons in particular.
I also wanted to hear that because Kay, who was in the chat earlier, is like, I'm always thinking like she gets something out of this, but very much does not identify also with the like fawny or like scrupulous parts of it, and very much has like a sort of demon girl persona.
So demons is like, so to give you just like a background on my life story, which I think is kind of, demon is the first identity that I formulated out of any of these. Demon was made in like a rejection of Eve as the name that I originally picked out when I was trying to come out. Because Eve, if you translate it, means like to live, to breathe. But also Eve, in the biblical sense, is very like secondary or submissive. So a different part of me picked
Twyman's interpretation of Eve, but go on.
Yeah, a different part of me picked Lilith as an alternative, but this connected with like a particular fighting part of me. And so demon to me is someone who is like disillusioned in the idea of any like system or any like specific cause or anything like that. The entire point is that there's me and there's the world, and that's it. I think of the world as being me and eventually stuff that I consider mine or on my side versus everything else. And everything else can get fucked. Like, I don't care. So originally it's just me, and I try to, survive, make do, and improve myself. And then eventually at some point I reach the level where it's like, okay, so now I have a place, I have people I care about, and my circle like expands to include them. So the demon perspective is extremely like actor centric. there is me as the actor, and there is other stuff that I affect. If I care about it, it's within my bounds. And if someone attacks something within my bounds, I will attack them back.
Oh, yeah. I can definitely identify with this kind of line of thinking, of course. This actually reminds me a lot of Orc in Williams Blake's writing, just as, like, the embodiment of, like, this primal, individualistic force of energy who kind of just rejects any sort of systematization of anything at all, breaks off from Urizen, who's like the personification of like both reason and moral law. And like to Blake, he's kind of simultaneously like, you know, a Christ figure and like a Miltonian Lucifer figure.
It's actually kind of funny thinking about this in relation to Blake, because there's something of a similar sort of almost like classifying mania and tapped into like a deep emotional and subjective intelligence that's like, and like that current of outsider art. Like,
as compared to Traumaqueer, I have no claims on the rejection of personhood, because this has been just a forever thing. Like,
right,
you know.
right.
But I find it somewhat uniquely funny that like No More Nights has been always called not a person, as this like display name or screen name. But where that came from was like back when I first came out in like the first 2 years of transition, where everything's kind of unstable and you're always kind of emotionally heightened. Like when I was going through like emotional swings, I would sometimes use that name as like kind of like an edgy Discord name.
Yeah.
As like a like as the idea of being like excluded or being unwanted or being seen as just a vehicle for someone's for the creation of something for someone. I think at some point I called this an automata for the creation of human experiences or something like that.
Yeah. Well, keep going.
And so this started out as just this like shit post of like changing my username, like you know, like the memes of like changing your profile picture to a sad anime picture, except like the username for a version of this. And so it became the screen name, and from the screen name, a lot of people were like, "Oh, I really like this," and suddenly it became a thing that people started saying more.
Huh.
So
I recall coming across James Healy, the women posting their L's guy who was formerly like a film Twitter general enemy. I remember coming across him like having a Milady Abbey. And that was extremely funny to me, because very specifically, obviously, of course, Mia was involved in, like, the whole Milady thing. The whole Milady thing was, like, obviously, like, a reactionary project and whatnot. But the thing that was funny to me is that, like, Milady was like a reactionary aesthetic project based on like a bizarre like sort of attempt at recuperation of like what I'd see as basically transsexual aesthetics, and so it just became really funny to me that James Healy was like these weird psychotic reactionaries had just tricked James Healy into like adopting the most transsexual aesthetic possible.
Like, this is kind of a good segue into some of the other stuff I wanted to talk about, insofar as when, Angie, you're describing Milady as kind of an appropriation of transsexual aesthetics. What you're describing as transsexual aesthetics, I very much could also probably describe as Traumaqueer aesthetics, in the sense of kind of giving, and that gives us like a window onto, okay, what is this possible broader usage of the term? I was going to bring us back on the topic of like what a sort of broader Traumaqueer aesthetic or like broader and since we already established early on, like, in a lot of cases this seems to correlate with a transsexual aesthetic, like, what is that? Like, when Angie, you said Milady seems to be, like, trying to tap into or appropriate that, what exactly do you think it is tapping into or imitating?
I'm not entirely sure, because
Imagine
obviously,
you weren't, because
like,
it's something
the whole Milady thing is, they cite, like, what they call, like, network spirituality,
Yeah.
and, like, neo-chibi aesthetics, and I think, like, part of that, I think, like, part of it is just, like, the fact, I think, like, a big part of it is very simply, you know, trans women, especially, just, like, being very online.
I
And,
don't
like,
the Milady like actual groups don't have that many trans women.
Well, that's the
Yeah,
thing. We were saying
in
they
fact,
are
they're
kind of
sort
a
of
gentrification
like
of those
so-
aesthetics.
yeah,
exactly.
That's the thing which makes it fascinating to me. It's just, like, you know, you have, like, very online trans women, like, creating these things that are, like,
I mean, I think part of what Angie is proposing here is
anime
that
influenced,
Yeah.
but also deconstructive of, like, the anime aesthetic and whatnot. And so, like,
I think deconstructive here is a like little move I would make to potentially define what we're talking about here. Off the top of my head right now, like I'm teaching an anime course, like I mean TA at at Western, and it's like I'm this, and we've been going over stuff like Evangelion, Gundam, Ghost in the Shell,
what I mean, especially, right, like, in this context, is, you know, you have like the already sort of preformed aesthetic of, like chibi and kawaii and, like, feminine cuteness.
yeah.
And so, like, I notice a lot of, especially trans people, not exclusively, but especially trans people online, engaging with these sorts of aesthetics and these sorts of styles in sort of a manner which involves, like, deliberately distorting them, deliberately making them, like, cruder and more messy in a way.
Yeah.
And,
I was going
like,
to say
you'll notice-
untying the gendered knot that sort of like maintains a semblance of like grand narrative unity in this database.
And the main thought that inspired me is just like I don't know. How many people have like a real like spiteful relationship to the kinds of media that gave them like fucked up extra dysphoria that made them want to look like either an anime twink or like an anime pinup girl or whatever, depending on their subclass or whatever.
yeah,
How much of that is just like a real representation of their like own feelings towards that aesthetic?
Yeah, that is very interesting.
Yeah. Like, you'll notice, like, the Milady figure, like, itself is, like, the Milady base, to, like, borrow a term from, like, you know, old DeviantArt, for instance. The Milady base is, like, kind of crudely drawn. And, like, crude and, like, deliberately crudely, messily drawn anime girl is, like, one of the hallmarks. It is, like, in my experience, one of the hallmarks that I've come across, like, basically a very sort of trans-centric aesthetic space. And so seeing it used in this context, seeing it used as, like, as like a surface level aesthetic for what is effectively like a reactionary project is fascinating. It's fascinating.
I'm not sure I would really call this a surface level aesthetic.
Yeah, I think there's something deeper to it.
Yeah, I mean, there is something deeper. What I mean
We're
is
identifying
that, like,
surface
the lady is
characteristics.
using it in, like, a more surface-level way, at the very least.
And we're using that to identify surface-level characteristics and then dialectically deeper to the, like, the underlying structural ones.
So, like, I can't really talk much about the aesthetic design of melody stuff. I don't know.
I mean, we have an idea that it's citing something, essentially. What are some of the things we'd say it's citing when we say, like, there's a bunch of stuff that's been doing this kind of thing already? I mean, like, there's...
I mean, they're like simultaneously trying to position themselves as sort of a throwback to, like, the earlier days of the internet.
Yeah.
And also, like, you know, how, like, neo-chibi, it's like... you simultaneously want to return to some sort of, like, long for earlier time, and also be like, no, this is new, this is a new spin on this. Really, like, you know, emerging, recent, cool thing kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but part of the paradox of this is what it's trying to return to is a moment when the internet felt like it had more novelty and felt like it hadn't been completely absorbed into existing cultural forms or its own kind of reified cultural forms. There's an attempt to, I think, in Milady seize a pre-culture war for one side of the culture war, in a way.
Yeah.
I honestly feel like what they really are trying to do is they're trying to use this nostalgia as a sort of, like, way to appeal to, like, I've talked about how, like, this is gonna sound strangely dark in this point of discussion.
That's
but, like,
perfectly fine.
If you have, like, grooming victims, a lot of the times they will have this perception of, like, oh, I was desirable when I was, like, a teen, and then people abandoned me, and then I grew up, and suddenly there's this entire complexity, and before this, people were just like, oh, just do this stuff for me, and I love you. And obviously this is false. Like, this didn't really work like that, but it still creates this sort of perception of, like, oh, I was desirable at this earlier point. And I feel like the lady, like, tries to play into this kind of thing, where it's like, you know, if you can return to this weird, mythical, imagined internet, where you're just this, like, cute character,
yeah.
Like, it's playing into what I consider to be the kind of, like, same kind of dynamic as, like, eating disorder culture.
And one of the other things I was going to connect that to, actually, is, like, insofar as we've been talking about sort of, like, aesthetic, like the relation to sort of anime aesthetics, and, like, that sort of, and kawaii and the sort of, like, neo-chibi thing, like, that sort of, like, a lot of what, say, moe is, like, an aestheticization of the long-term fawn personality that can be kind of tapped into from either side, and that plugs very into, like, I've written a paper about, like, cuteness as a concept, and I think one of my, like, major, like, life's work projects is, like, trying to develop essentially a life-affirming form of cuteness, and not necessarily a purely sort of negative, submissive one, but, like, there is a very easy sort of, like, jouissance to tap into there, and a lot of, like, the latest couple of generations tap into that a lot. Like, but putting it in this explicit trauma context is, like, is kind of, like, revealing the underlying structure in a way.
Yeah, that makes sense. I personally, like, never fell for, like, I never really fell for, like, the Milady's, like, invocation of nostalgia, because, like, the aesthetic design itself didn't really remind me of, like, old 4chan, for instance, so much as it reminded me of, like, I don't know, 2016 Tumblr or something.
Yeah.
But the 2016 Tumblr, like, that is what part of what I'm thinking of as an already vulgarized early Traumaqueer aesthetic. That's already citing something. Like, it's already citing something, in fact.
Yeah.
Like,
I figure another. Oh, sorry. I was just about to say, like, I figure, like, another, like, big source for, like, some of this aesthetic, is, like, sort of, like, Denpa, like, 2000s, like, Denpa, especially I'm thinking of, like, visual novels, like, I guess, Subarashiki Hibi or something, where, like, the, where, like, the appearance of, like, these sort of degraded and deliberately, I guess, crudified aesthetics, like, corresponds and correlates to a great extent with, like, the onset of psychosis and the appearance of psychological trauma and, like, the narrative.
I don't know much about that.
I think this is a good time to pivot to, again, we were, like, when I was talking about things that I think established a, like, broader part of the aesthetic some of these things are citing, I was hoping to have Alvin on by now to talk about, Porpentine, which I think I read Psycho Nymph Exile for this. He read another one. I don't know if who else here what has other people read here of her stuff? Because I think it is kind of a touchstone in...
I've read Second Nymph Exile.
Yeah.
I've read Hello Aesthetic Lab. That's about it.
Yeah. I mean,
I've, like, played
Nymph
some
Exile
games,
is
like,
more than enough.
years ago, but don't have much of a memory.
I mean, do we think this relates to this category in any meaningful way? I also wanted to get into, like, Sour Milk, which has more of the sort of realistic, insofar as we're depicting all these kind of, like, trauma-adjacent social dynamics that don't have representation in mainstream literature, and I think just saying that, actually, it's interesting how representation is thought of entirely in terms of, like, unitary identities and characters and attributes, and not in terms of, like, dynamics and, like, experiences and, like, social facts and events. But, yeah. But Porpentine is interesting insofar as, I think we were talking about last time, one thing a lot of this does relative to mainstream depictions of trauma is this sort of interior reality, as opposed to depicting it literally, or as opposed to this, like, confessional model where fiction dealing with trauma is aligned with autofiction and this sort of, like, approach to a kind of reified reality. It actually tries to tap into sort of the real of this reality distorting experience by being very indirect. Actually, I remember when I was, like, in high school, there was a presentation at my high school, I think for my lit program. There was not Michael Chabin, Jan Martel, the Life of Pi guy, and he was talking about his new book, which wasn't very good, but, like, it was his attempt at, like, Holocaust literature through a weird sort of fable, and he was talking about how, like, Holocaust literature tends to be, like, overly literal, which I think kind of exposes probably a, like, inadequate reading in Holocaust literature on his part, because, like, what about Paul Celan? But like, that sort of this, like what he was arguing that like this moment is not so traumatic that it cannot be represented through the imagination, that it has to be represented through kind of a bare positivism. In fact, it, if anything, can't be represented through that kind of bare positivism, is sort of the thing we see in Porpentine, where like all her stuff is kind of like set in a world built entirely on the logic of trauma queerness, whatever that is. Like, and there's just all these sort of like, it's like when it, like, there's this kind of Evangelion thing, there's these, with the mecha battles, you're part of a state that's essentially, like, forcing you into these, like, surreal interfaces with the flesh. You're, like, there's, like, girl chunks, which is some kind of a drug or, like, mysterious substance. There's, like, kudzu everywhere. There's this, like, splitting off universes and constant sort of ambiguity between what's real and not real, even within the setting. Like, and then and then the actual life it ends up representing is mostly extremely mundane. And all the sort of the trauma itself, rather than being located in the narrative, is kind of like distributed throughout the narrative. In fact, the thing I kind of got into with the was thinking about last time, but didn't get to properly express with the mainstream trauma literature, is that like on one hand, trauma, even in the mainstream, to an extent I'm not 100% sure like is adequate, is represented as like this event that breaks your ability to form narrative, to form a beginning, a middle, and end. And then simultaneously, the way it's used in, say, the trauma plot is as something that establishes a beginning, middle, and end to narrative. It's as a backstory and as something that the temporality of the fiction is defined around before and after, which is very much the opposite in something like Psycho Nymph Exile, or something like a lot of Empty Spaces fic, where there's like not a clear point at which someone became like a witch or a doll or an angel or whatever category, although I've seen a bunch where that are sort of like in an origin kind of mode too.
Right. Yeah, it's a lot of the kind of stuff that I like about Porpentine's writing is that it feels like the inside of the mind of someone that's going through a bunch of shit. Just because it is fairly disjointed in it's like it's a series of these little vignettes pierced together with a sort of overarching plot.
Although
And I think
yeah, keep going.
I think that's actually like a good way of representing trauma. Because
that's also
the worst times,
sorry, keep going.
at the worst times myself personally, I sort of lose a sense of narrative. It becomes this like weird, like I wake up at the moment, there's a bunch of shit happening, I do something, and then something else happens. I think about something. It's like it's just like weird discrete memory formation kind of thing, and this interacts with like memory loss and plurality and other stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I like that sort of writing.
Yeah,
and I think the idea of like there's sort of like distinct timelines between like the like person who's experiencing something and the way that other people perceive them.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's the same kind of thing about like autism awareness versus like autism kind of shit.
Yeah.
Like, they approach this entire thing from very different angles. And even if you do actually try to emphasize with people that are going through something like this, which is not the case for autism moms, but point aside, like it is still fundamentally fairly different just because of the way that your mind reacts to a lot of this. Like the person going through this, they become this like episodic switching, have these like rather distinct reactions to a lot of the stuff that's happening to them. But to the person who's just observing them, it's like, oh, they reached a certain threshold, they got really weird, and then after whatever ended, they like tried to like piece together, but they never really quite made it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so like, I do think that a lot of this really depends on which perspective you're using in this case.
Yeah. I was going to point out one, like, as a sort of Adornian, like, the sort of language we're using here of this kind of non-narrative and, like, fragmented subjectivity representing the sort of actual subjective state of this trauma is also a big, like, point in the aesthetics of high modernism. Like, that's something that's used to sort of justify the musical language of a Schoenberg or an Alban Berg or like the literary style of a Beckett. But also we're looking at clearly something very different from high modernism or even postmodernism with somebody like Porpentine. And I'm curious how you imagine that difference working, or if anyone is like...
Yeah, I'm not sure I can speak much to that. Yeah.
Angie, you might, because you know more of that kind of, like, at least with your musical interests, but I mean, that's probably my business to, I mean, part of the thing I sort of
ask me the question again.
How the sort of like the sort of way of representing sort of traumatized, fragmented subjectivity in stuff like Porpentine and the kinds of art we've been talking about differs from the way of doing it in, like, high modernism, like Schoenberg or Beckett or something.
I'm honestly not entirely sure because, like, I myself draw from modernism quite a bit. I'd say, like, I honestly am not sure exactly how I'd state the difference myself. I figure part of what distinguishes a figure like Porpentine is like a very heavy drawing on the trappings of genre fiction, especially, you know, science fiction and fantasy.
Yeah.
But in sort of like, if I had to name a predecessor, it'd be like 90s, 2000s bizarro fiction.
Yeah.
In the sense that, like, it doesn't really use these, like, genre tropes as tropes in and of themselves. It's not attempting to portray, like, necessarily a particularly coherent narrative so much as it's trying to elaborate upon, like, the germ of its content as much as possible. So,
I like that phrasing, elaborate on the germ of its content, because on one hand, like, the germ of its content is this very Adornian image of, like, the central contradiction or the truth content, but then this sort of, like, elaboration is this kind of, like, ornamental approach to that. Like, I think that clarifies a lot.
For instance, I say that because, like, you know, having read a few, like, bizarro novellas years ago, like, what I remember of them is generally just, like, you know, in science fiction, for instance, like in classic golden age science fiction, Asimov, for instance, you typically, like, have, like, a device or something along those lines. You have a device or a concept or something of the sort that you want to explore, or a destination or a planet or what have you. Like if you want to tell. If you want to tell a science fiction story in like the classical mode, what you really want to do is you want to like tell a story about like what are the potentials of say a levitation device. How do people use this levitation device to surmount difficulties? What are the problems with a levitation device? And say like if you're talking about an alien civilization, like if your like heroes are spacefaring and they have a levitation device and they go to another planet with it, like how does like this aid their interaction with the alien species? Like maybe the alien species have problems because like their society requires the transportation of really huge materials or something. And maybe the levitation device is useful for moving these materials around, for instance. But then, like, or like in a fantasy story, like very often, like the central motif is sort of just how people interact with the world of magic. Like how, like, very often I see, like, in classic fantasy stories, like an ordinary hero trying to traverse, like, magical spaces that obey laws that are outside of the ordinary hero's, like, domain, outside of like the usual village life or something.
We're going a bit long on this one. Let's tie it back to Porcupine.
Yeah. Thank you for pointing that out to me. So like, by contrast, like I read a Bizarro novel, for instance. I read a Bizarro novella or something, and instead of trying to tell a story about that, instead of taking the concept of like, okay, I have a levitation device, say, what do I do with this? You're asking some very orthogonal questions. You're asking like, I have all these genre elements. I have levitation devices and monsters and magic and whatnot. And the first question is, isn't that fucking weird? Isn't that strange? Isn't that strange in and of itself to have these things that are so removed from our everyday experience? And then what you're really trying to do is you're trying to take the strangenesses of these things, as well as the strangeness of things that you find in your ordinary life, and blend them while sort of exaggerating them more and more and more to a point where they don't really resemble anything like really explicitly like to be found in more traditional stories or in, you know, the everyday world. You're trying to exaggerate them until you have something that is actually beyond caricature into like this sort of farcical romp. And I think part of what ties that in with the work of somebody like, I don't know, somebody like Porcupine is like, instead of exploiting this for like solely like the weirdo humor, horror comedy value alone, you're also kind of like exploiting it. And plenty of Bizarro fiction doesn't just do that, of course, just so I don't accidentally say something too like generalized about Bizarro fiction. You know, instead, what Porcupine, for instance, is trying to do is take that sort of that same sort of like exaggeration beyond the point of caricature as like a launching pad to explore a whole variety of emotions and situations and dynamic
from like a totally orthogonal angle to like the typical everyday reality of them in order to sort of shine a new light about what's going on there, in order to like sort of extract those dynamics from like something that could be said, okay, this is ordinary, we can judge this according to the standards of like the everyday world. And trying to say, okay, let's take these out of proportion, let's take these out of any sense of normality. What are we looking at here?
Going to say, like, on one hand, it's way more sort of conceptually decentralized than I even realized, although I did have a sense of that. I will note that there does seem to be a very broad kind of like stylistic and aesthetic similarity, which I'm curious how that sort of, or how you see that as kind of arising, and how you would describe it in a literary context. And I might also bring in Caraparcel on this, because read, I think it was Elsa's compilation, and yeah, we were, like, Caraparcel is just, like, a style obsessive, so that's sort of what, part of what he's sort of zeroed in on.
I think there's a few different like voice styles and ways of doing empty spaces stuff. Like there's a very distinct like No More Nights kind of post, which is usually like 1 or 2 tweets with very like it's like heavy implication, first person describing something that's happening while talking to someone else kind of thing. And that voice, like some people picked up. A bunch of other people write vignettes. Some other people just really just want to write short stories, but instead split them in tweets because short stories don't get nearly as much engagement as tweets do.
Yeah.
Just a minute, I have to cookie.
Yeah, I've definitely found, like, as a fiction writer, like, the tweet format lends itself to a very particular sort of concision. Like, even in the ones that are clearly just sort of, like, broken up short stories. But, like, I could not break up many of my short stories into tweets because I will have, like, sentences that go on half a paragraph. Like, it's, I'm trying to figure out how to, I guess, like, the fact that we said voice is that there is something, like, there is something very voice-like about the style, in a way. Like, that voice is the major sort of aesthetic category of style, as opposed to, I'm not sure what I'm opposing this to, but, like, it's definitely, like, on some level, the category of voice is applicable to everything, and on another level, like, there's definitely aesthetics in which it feels more or less applicable as a metaphor. Like, I remember when I was in creative writing program, like, everyone was talking about voice in relation to their poems, and I'm like, I don't even know how to apply this to my poems, because my poems are just, like, these completely depersonalized, like, language clouds half the time. Like,
I think that No More Nights has a fairly particular voice. I can describe what it is.
Yeah.
I can give it quantities.
Yeah.
But like I don't think Alice, for example, uses
Right.
it. I think Alice usually writes stories, and so does Alice. Some other people do use that particular way of doing it, but you know, I don't think it's really like specific to Empty Spaces.
Mhm.
Or at least it's not like Empty Spaces isn't exclusively using it.
Well, I guess we could put it in the context of, like, okay, like, Twitter microfiction is itself kind of like, it's been around for a while, and there's other Twitter microfiction and micro-literature that's probably been talked about a lot more, and most of the Empty Spaces stuff, I found sound... Okay, I'm trying to remember if this is one of the things I'm thinking of, but, like, what are some of like the Twitter microfiction classics? Like, what are the main
Pyramid Twitter for one.
Oh,
that's like
There's
that's
control
like
creep.
Yeah, control creep.
Yeah.
It's also the space that like Night Vale, for instance, grew out of.
Yeah, I was going to say
There was
Night Vale,
also-
and then I keep seeing it's a podcast, but I remember Twitter being a big part of it. Like, I didn't actually
There's also
follow
someone
Night
that's like a capsule something or another. Capsule 169, I want to say. Feed 3.
Gabe and I were discussing a little the potential of talking about like I guess like you know Alfred's Playhouse and Nana's Everyday Life and Please Forgive Me and like BN Cup type stuff.
Nana's Everyday Life,
Yeah, Dan Kim had nice influence on me, actually.
Yes. Fuck.
did?
Yeah, Nana's Everyday Life is like the Elfin Lead fan comic.
It's the Elfin comic, from
Yes.
Yeah,
Yep.
which I really loved.
It's a
I
huge
still-
influence.
I still think like the fucking like one like that's just like wordless up until it just gets to is this comedy is just like one of the most genuinely hard hitting things I've seen on the internet.
There's a funny bit about the Nana's Everyday Life comic, which is I've seen it like years ago at some point, but I was reminded of this because there's a particular person who like read my alt like several months after I started writing, and then they like had a breakdown, and then they tried taking acid and being good on acid, and then they like almost killed themselves. And when they came back from this, they like talked to me, and they're like, "Holy shit! I suddenly feel like so much less dissociated. I feel like I actually like feel alive to some degree." And the very first thing that they tried to bond with me over was trying to like do this comic and describe it in comparison to some of my writing. I was like, "Oh yeah, I've seen this from like a while ago." But
Yeah, I'm actually in the comments section for like the last comic, if I recall. I wrote a comment like years ago being like, yeah, this helped me process some shit.
Yeah. A lot of people responded to Norman Knight's stuff with that too. It's just like, oh, this is the first time I've seen this recognized.
I wanted to say before you left that when you were describing just like writing things for people when like they would tell you about their experiences or like some like dynamic or thing they would try to process, and you'd be like, oh, I can like try and write something around that. That is one of the coolest ways of writing I've ever heard anyone describe. It's like I almost like.
I think there's 3 separate threads on Number Nights, which are all about the concept of like you're like late teenage and someone like picks you up and they promise you the world and they're like, we're gonna do so much great shit. We're all these like anarchist communities and you can be a participant. You're so smart. Like and then it just like you come into this and you gradually descend into like you get ignored, like you get devalued. Whenever you try to speak up, people are like, "Oh, it doesn't matter that much. Don't worry about it. It's okay." And then eventually it just like gets worse and worse until you get abused, and then they just like cut you out and like scapegoat you. Like this is based off of a real thing.
Yeah.
It took me 3 separate threads to actually try to like nail the exact feeling down, because the person who I wrote this for the first 2 threads was like, yeah, like these parts are right, but these parts aren't. And then for the third one, they were like, yeah, okay, you mostly get it.
I'd also
So the way of empathizing with them.
Yeah, that's a really cool as a procedure for, like, not just as a procedure for writing or a procedure for therapy, like as a writing as a procedure for empathy. Like, yeah. And I was also wanted to say that's kind of a contrast with another one of the aspects of the sort of mainstream trauma narrative that identifies it with confessional and identifies it with this principle where, like, you're increasingly restricting the extent to which you can write about anyone else. And the idea of trauma as this, like, singularly isolating thing that, like, only you can ever possibly write about your own, and only someone else can only ever possibly write about their own, and there's no possible sort of, like, being together in the sort of liberal model of it. Whereas, yeah.
The trauma licenses.
So here's the secret. And this is a fairly interesting secret, I think. Like, there are a lot of people that come to me to discuss stuff. And sometimes it's people who have been involved in the same, kind of thing. Like, sometimes I get people who were at the same, falling apart of the company. Or I get two people from, opposite sides of, a bad relationship talking to me. And, most people, when they do talk to me, think, I want to keep everything private. Like, nothing should be discussed. Everything is confidential. Nothing is to be shared. And I'm not a licensed therapist. I'm not a doctor. I'm not any official.
Well, that's another one of those paradoxes of the liberal attitude that, like, whenever anyone's talking about anything, it's like, you should talk to a therapist, assuming you have, like, $150 a week to pay.
The thing is, so I do not necessarily always play, very straight with this.
Yeah.
I actually think that if people tell me that they want to keep something, private, I will do this. But when people tell me a lot of stuff without the explicit proclamation that they don't want people to share this, sometimes I will use this to either, give other people examples or instructions for how things can work out, or sometimes even talk to the other parties involved. But I try to do this to the best of my ability, and I've been doing this for about 5 or 6 years now. And I always thought that at some point someone would be like, you told this thing that I told you in private to this other party, you violated my trust, you're being a shitty person. But all in all, I've never actually had that experience. But I've had about, I don't know, somewhere between half a dozen to a dozen experiences where people were like, I'm glad you helped me work out this thing. Because a neutral third party can sometimes synthesize several different worldviews and try to share them in a way that is not favoring one or the other, but trying to actually foster some sort of communication between different parts.
Oh my god, I'm thinking of Auspice Homestuck. 2 seconds.
Say?
I know this isn't quite what you're talking about, but this just reminds me of Auspice Ship in Homestuck, which is the one troll romance nobody talks about anymore.
Whenever people compare me to Homestuck, I feel like it's time to log off.
I feel like from my own personal perspective, I haven't done exactly that sort of thing where I write things for other people specifically. But I do have the experience of as a musician, when I'm writing a song, when I'm writing it lyrically and sonically and whatnot, very often, very often, the subject matter of a huge amount of my music is trauma in some form or another, and when I write it, very often I try to go into it with very often I will try to go into it with a more standard confessional mode, and I do attempt, and I do have a few songs that are in that sort of genre to an extent, but very often what I'm very often when I attempt to go into it with confessional mode, the result usually disappoints me. The result usually just feels this is stupid. This doesn't work for me. I'm not interested in this, and I end up scrapping it. And then I remind myself,
of what the purpose of my musical project is, what I set out to do specifically was that I find a great degree of comfort in music, of course, and in general, like what I was looking for in music was something that I couldn't necessarily find in any existing music. So what I wanted to do was create the music that would have been immensely helpful and refreshing to somebody like me. Somebody like me, not necessarily even me exactly, not even someone with like the same experiences or even similar experiences as me, but someone in like the same sort of predicament as me, feeling like they need something to listen to that like speaks to the feelings that they're having, something that speaks to like the situations they found themselves in, but only being able to find sort of approximations of that. And so I end up writing music with like what would have comforted me or somebody like me. What would I listen to with a group of friends while like thinking about these sorts of subjects? What would feel most apropos to that situation? And what would I think make someone what would make someone who hasn't been in this sort of situation understand that situation on an empathetic level rather than like at a voyeuristic level? And what would make someone who has been in that sort of situation or that sort of predicament think, yes, I feel represented. I feel like this song is actually speaking to me on that level.
I want to move.
We should. I do think it would be fun to like try to like just like edit this in such a way where we just like move everything the fuck around.
Oh, that's probably going to happen because again,
it might be necessary. Honestly,
backloaded a bunch of the basic context. So
yeah, just cut out a bunch of like the random rambling and just like move everything around so it's like more of like an impressionist quasi narrative.
Oh my god, we're going to turn it into an Adam Curtis. Okay. I'll see how much editing
if you
I
want,
can do
I'll
over the
compose
weekend.
fucking music for it. Why not?
Holy shit. Yeah, okay.
Once parts 1 and 2 are all recorded and you get it edited into something, I'll like fucking compose like little theme tunes.
All right.
Like light motifs for each theme.
Oh hell yes, this is gonna rule.